At the beginning of the 3rd century AD, the theologian and philosopher Clement of Alexandria declared, "Egypt was the mother of magicians." No wonder, in the minds of other ancient peoples, this land was famous above all for its learned priests, the carriers of the Book of Ritual, sages with a distinctive exotic appearance. They were skilled in healing techniques, binding powerful spiritual beings, but also inflicting damage on enemies through spells. An Egyptian magician is a scholar and a priest, thoroughly educated in the mysterious institution, the temple's adjacent houses of life. He knows how to read and write hieroglyphs, knows the ancient books and their secret formulas. He's a magician because he knows. According to pharaonic sources, knowledge of the words of power enabled some of them to become possessors of a truly powerful force, transcending the cosmic realm, thus possessing the ability to manipulate all creation. This manipulation of the universal, all-encompassing power called Heka was understood in ancient Egypt as magic. Magic was the foundation of all major and minor state cults, and also played a key role in the personal piety of ordinary people. But what was it really? Who were the Lector Priests? And what did the Egyptians write about their magical wars fought against other kingdoms? Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel Ancient Sites Girl. I invite you to a podcast about the history of ancient Egypt. This time I want to tell you about Egyptian magicians. But today, for a change, we won't be focusing on funerary or apotropaic magic. Instead, we'll learn fascinating stories about miracles performed by magicians, like from the tale of Setna and Osiris, and the so-called Cheops and the magicians. But we'll also look into the Bible and apocryphal texts. So ahead of us, a lot of original ancient texts. So let's get started. The Egyptian term Heka, or Coptic Hek, is often translated as magic, but it's much more than that. Heka was identified with the male, active and creative aspect of God, with the all-encompassing creative power, released along with Maat at the very beginning of creation in the first time, Zeptepi. It was the primordial power of effectiveness, the main component of the rapidly expanding universe, a force that can only be balanced by Maat, the feminine ordering principle, which gives it the desired form. Heka is a pre-cosmic power derived directly from the creator who wasn't created, the only one, amun-ra, as taught by the most influential in Egypt Heliopolitan theologians. While Maat was identified with the creator's daughter, Tefnut, Heka was associated with his son, Shu, who in the coffin texts calls himself Life. Considering the hieroglyphic representation of the word, Heka may literally mean using the Ka, and Ka is life, and for sure the life force itself. Sometimes Heka was depicted as a separate deity, or rather a personification of the force, in the form of the creator's firstborn son. A naked boy with a side lock of youth, worshipped in Heliopolis, Memphis and Esna. But there was no doubt that all deities draw their magical power from him. In one of the spells from the coffin texts we read, "I am he whom the Only One created, before the duality even came into being in the world, before he sent forth his sole eye. He created me when he was utterly alone, as an utterance from his mouth, before his ka was a millionfold, to protect all beings. I have the power to protect the divine command. I am the one who allows the host of gods to act. I am the one who fulfills all the desires of the Father of gods. I am Heka. The famous French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero claimed, "Ancient magic was the very foundation of religion. The faithful who desired to obtain some favor from a god had no chance of succeeding except by laying hands on the deity, and this arrest could only be effected by means of a certain number of rites, sacrifices, prayers, and chants, which the god himself had revealed and which obliged him to do what was demanded of him." Magic, understood as universal energy, was released through ritual and the utterance of words of power. Precise recitation of spells was key to imbuing rituals with power, including objects and ingredients used during the magical ritual. This was an important and delicate and certainly dangerous field, best left to professionals. Rigorously adhering to the rules of ritual purity, the priest is the most common type of Egyptian magician, according to literature. This purity was achieved by abstaining from forbidden activities, such as, for example, eating pork or fish, avoiding unclean people, animals, and substances, and purifying the body in every possible way, including bathing in temple lakes and shaving all hair on the head and body. Incense, an element of purification and elevating the atmosphere, was often burned during magical rituals, adding an aura of mystery to the magician, who was always dressed in pure white linen, often adorned with a ceremonial robe imitating a leopard skin. Circumcision also appears to have been a requirement of purity in certain periods. Spells in Greco-Egyptian papyri sometimes state that the magician couldn't have intercourse for several days before engaging in a specific magical ritual. Religious practices performed within the official and representative space of the temple were primarily focused on maintaining the divine social order and the cosmic balance, Ma'at. The priest addressed the divine in its local incarnation, the lord or mistress of the temple and the city. The sacred image had to be washed, dressed, anointed, and fed, like a king in his palace. However, the clergy's duties concerning the divine sphere weren't limited to adoration and affirmation. They were obligated to make the gods maintain Ma'at, to restrain them from violent reaction, often by force. And that's what magic is. Threats directed at the deities could be the only guarantee of maintaining order and preventing catastrophe. If the Egyptians saw their gods as natural phenomena, the principles that govern the universe, rather than as merciful protectors, such practices seem logical. Thanks to ancient texts, we know that in private magic, deities were often threatened with the pollution and desecration of their temples and the annihilation of their sacred animals. One of the medical spells for headaches promises the slaughter of a sacred cow in the courtyard of the goddess Hathor if the patient doesn't recover. The magician might threaten to rub the sacred image of Anubis in the hide taken from an unclean dog, etc. Magicians often used formulas that pious Egyptians would consider offensive and sacrilegious. Some threats involve a large-scale cosmic catastrophe, such as the Nile will not flood, the sky will fall to earth, and the entire solar cycle will be disrupted if the spell fails. In this case, mud, which the creator feeds on, becomes a bargaining chip in the magician's mouth. He usually hedges his bets by saying, "It's not me saying this, but," and here he gives the name of a specific deity, drawing on his advanced theological and mythological knowledge. In the famous book of overthrowing Apep from the 4th century BC, powerful rituals aimed at the forces of chaos threatening all creation are reinforced by the priest lecturer's invocation of Isis and Thoth's Heka, the Eye of Ra, the Eye of Horus, and the Spear of Seth. Chaos was magically overpowered by burning the written name of the eternal enemy of creation, the cosmic serpent Apep, in temple pits, or by sealing his image in a box and burying it. This method of control over evil seems to be a precursor to the later Islamic tradition of trapping a genie in a bottle. The ritual of overpowering Apep was performed regularly in temples across the country. It had a state character, serving the state's interest. Magic was to be a powerful weapon of the empire of the pharaohs. Rulers thus surrounded themselves with magicians. The figure of the knowledgeable magician residing at court appears in famous Egyptian literary works. He speaks before the pharaoh, is in the royal service, and sometimes belongs to the royal family. In particular, in some narratives, besides professional priests, the king or the king's son is a learned magician with a priestly title. Court magicians were popular literary figures. Manuscripts copied by scribes describing their adventures circulated among the literate elite of pharaonic Egypt. Some of them have survived to this day, like the so-called Westcar papyrus of Berlin 3033, brought from Egypt by British adventurer Henry Westcar in the 1820s and subsequently purchased by the Berlin Museum. It contains 5 tales of miracles performed by priests and magicians. According to the text, each is retold at the court of King Khufu by his sons. Although the story takes place in the 26th century BC, the text likely dates from the 12th dynasty and is considered a masterpiece of Middle Kingdom literature. The aforementioned papyrus, however, is a copy from the Second Intermediate Period, from around 1600 BC. The story survives in only one single copy, and its initial part is lost. According to the text, the sons of the famous builder of the Great Pyramid, King Khufu, compete to entertain him with tales of the feats of wonder performed by famous magicians. The first tale likely concerned the legendary Imhotep, but that part has been lost. The second tells of a priest who transformed a wax crocodile into a real one and used it to capture his wife's lover. The first of the sons, Khafre, recounted a story handed down from the time of the king's ancestor, Nebka. This ruler went to the temple of Ptah, and on the way he stopped at the house of his chief lector priest, Ubaner. The ruler was accompanied by his entourage, including a page boy with whom Ubaner's wife had become infatuated. She sent her maid to him with a gift, a chest full of beautiful garments and an invitation. They met secretly in Ubaner's garden pavilion, where they drank wine and enjoyed themselves. A steward of the house considered it his duty to inform his master of this, and Ubaner, being a man skilled in magic, decided to take revenge. He fashioned a 7 fingers long crocodile from wax and cast a spell on it. In the evening, the page went to the garden lake to bathe. Then, following his master's instructions, the steward threw the wax crocodile into the water. He immediately transformed into a living creature, a huge beast 7 cubits long. Opening his terrifying jaws, he seized the page and dragged him underwater. During this time, the king stayed with Ubaner, and after 7 days, he was to set out again. As he was about to leave, the priest asked the king to come and witness his magic skills. When they reached the lake, the magician summoned a crocodile which immediately emerged from the water, holding the unfortunate page in its mouth. "O king," said Ubaner, "whatever I wish this crocodile to do, it will do it." Somewhat frightened, the pharaoh demanded that the animal be returned to the water, but Ubaner lifted the crocodile in his hands and it immediately transformed back into a tiny wax figure. When he told the king what had happened between the page and his wife, the outraged monarch ordered the crocodile to recapture the servant, which it promptly did, plunging into the water with its victim and vanishing forever. Nebka then ordered Ubaner's wife to be captured, burnt at the stake, and her ashes thrown into the Nile. Khufu was so pleased with this story that he ordered that Nebka's castle be offered 1,000 loaves of bread, 100 mugs of beer, an ox, and incense. Ubaner's ka also received generous offerings. In the Westcar papyrus, the primary duty of the Lector Priest is to serve the king. The chief Lector Priest, in particular, was considered a ritual expert in magical practices to such an extent that his title, Kheri Tep, in later periods became the term for magician. They played a very important political role, participating in diplomatic missions and in the pharaoh's military campaigns. Most Lector Priests, however, were associated with a temple institution known as Per Ankh, House of Life. Many large cult temples, and perhaps even some mortuary ones, had their houses of life within or near the sanctuary. This institution served as a scriptorium, library, priestly school, and likely a forge for Egyptian magicians. Its primary function appears to have been the development and recording of protective rituals. Some houses of life were particularly renowned for their libraries. In several ancient tales, lector priests or scribes traveled from the capital to consult ancient records, primarily at Hermopolis, the cult center of Thoth, the creator of writing and patron of scribes, scholars, and magicians. We know that the great temple of Ptah at Memphis also had a significant library, and in the first millennium BC, the houses of life at Bubastis and Sais in the Nile Delta were particularly famous. The Kheri Hub, literally carriers of the books of ritual, enjoyed a reputation as sages, reciting incantations and hymns during major religious festivals. They likely didn't participate in daily services at the sanctuary, but were responsible for certain specific magical rituals performed less frequently. Although subject to the same rules of ritual purity as other priests, Lector Priests were not part of the main temple hierarchy. Undoubtedly, among the Lector Priests we can identify court magicians. They were an important link between temples and the outside world, utilizing their knowledge to officiate at high-profile funerals, and it seems perform magical rituals for lay people. Naturally, they were charged for these services, but it's unclear what part of the fee went to the temple and how much to the priest. Most priests received a fixed salary in the form of a portion of the temple offerings. But let's return to Khufu's court. Another of his sons told of a miraculous event that took place during the reign of his predecessor, the great Snefru, builder of the Dahshur pyramids. Snefru fell into a depression. He searched every room of his palace for something to cheer him up, but in vain. So he summoned Zazamang, his chief lector priest, to whom he related his predicament. Zazamang recommended that the king spend a relaxing day on the palace lake, while his boat was rowed by barely clothed handmaidens. Quote, "Then said Zazamang to him, 'Let thy majesty go upon the lake of the palace, and let there be made ready a boat with all the fair maidens of the harem of thy palace. And the heart of thy majesty shall be refreshed with the sight in seeing they rowing up and down the water, and seeing the goodly pools of the birds upon the lake, and beholding its sweet fields and grassy shores. Thus will thy heart be lightened, and I also will go with thee. Bring me 20 oars of ebony, inlaid with gold, with blades of light wood, inlaid with electrum. And bring me 20 maidens, fair in their limbs, their bosoms and their hair, all virgins. And bring me 20 nets, and give these nets unto the maidens for their garments. 20 singing girls were to row the boat. The king's heart rejoiced at the sight of them, but one of the ladies, steering the boat, lost a malachite jewel attached to her hair. She immediately stopped singing, and her companions also stopped rowing. "The helmswoman is not rowing," they called to Snefru. When the king asked why she was not rowing, she replied, "My malachite jewel has fallen into the water, and my heart is sad." The king, to console her, assured her that he would replace the jewel. But she childishly replied that she wanted her own malachite jewel. So the king summoned Zazamang. The priest-lector uttered a powerful incantation, and behold, the waters of the lake parted, so that the king and the rowers could see her piece of jewelry lying on the dry bottom. Quote, "Then the chief lector priest Zazamang spake his magic speech, and he placed one part of the waters of the lake upon the other, and discovered the jewel lying upon a shard. And he took it up and gave it unto its mistress. And the water, which was 12 cubits deep in the middle, reached now to 24 cubits after he turned it. And he spake, and used his magic speech, and he brought again the water of the lake to its place." This astonishing deed gladdened everyone's hearts. Zazamang was richly rewarded for his magical skills, and Khufu was so pleased with this story that he ordered that an offering be made to Snefru's ka, similar to that offered to Nebka, and that Zazamang's ka should receive a loaf of bread, a jug of beer, and incense. Khufu's third son, Hordedef, announced that he knew a magician not from the past, like the rest, but one who still lives. Quote, "And His Majesty said, 'Who is he, Hordedef?' And the royal son Hordedef answered, 'It's a certain man named Daddy, who dwells at Detsnefru. He's a man of 110 years old, and he eats 500 loaves of bread and a side of beef, and drinks 100 draughts of beer unto this day. He knows how to restore the head that is smitten off. He knows how to cause the lion to follow him trailing his halter on the ground. He knows the designs of the dwelling of Thoth.'" Hordedef claimed that the elder magician Daddy could bring the dead back to life, tame wild animals, and what particularly intrigued the king, knew the secret plans of the House of Thoth, plans that would undoubtedly be useful in building his Great Pyramid. He immediately ordered the respected old man brought to Memphis, which Prince Hordedef did personally. When Daddy appeared before His Majesty, the king asked, "Is it true that which men say that thou canst restore the head which is smitten off?" And Daddy replied, "Truly I know that, O king, life, wealth and health, my lord." And His Majesty said, "Let one bring me a prisoner who's in prison, that his punishment may be fulfilled." And Daddy said, "Let it not be a man, O king, my lord. Behold, we do not even thus to our cattle." And a duck was brought unto him, and its head was cut off. And the duck was laid on the west side of the hall, and its head on the east side of the hall. And Daddy spake his magic speech. And the duck fluttered along the ground, and its head came likewise. And when it had come part to part, the duck stood and quacked. And they brought likewise a goose before him, and he did even so unto it. His Majesty caused an ox to be brought, and its head cast on the ground. And Daddy spake his magic speech, and the ox stood upright behind him, and followed him with his halter trailing on the ground. Khufu, delighted with the success of these experiments, asked Daddy if he knew the plans of the House of Thoth. Quote, "And is it true what is said, that thou knowest the number of the designs of the dwelling of Thoth?" And Daddy replied, "Pardon me, I know not their number, O king, life, wealth and health, but I know where they are." And His Majesty said, "Where is that?" And Daddy replied, "There's a chest of whetstone in a chamber named the Planrum in Heliopolis. They are in this chest." And Daddy said further unto him, "O king, life, wealth and health, my lord, it is not I that is to bring them to thee." And His Majesty said, "Who then is it that shall bring them to me?" And Daddy answered to him, "It is the eldest of 3 children who are in the body of Rudidet who shall bring them to thee." "And who is Rudidet?" asked Khufu. "She is," Daddy replied, "the wife of the priest of Ra, the lord of Zakhebu." But these 3 sons of hers are sons of the god Ra, who promised her that they would rule over this land. At these words, the king's heart was greatly troubled, and Daddy, seeing this, comforted him, saying, "Do not be afraid of what I've said, O king, for your son will reign, and also your son's son, before the sons of Rudidet take power over the land. This offspring of Ra has not yet been born." Then the magician was placed in Hordedef's palace, and daily received 1,000 loaves of bread, 100 tankards of beer, an ox, and 100 bunches of onions. These three sons of Ra were the future pharaohs of the 5th dynasty, established at the turn of the 26th and 25th centuries BC by the high priest of Ra, Osiris. Their miraculous birth, assisted by Khnum, Isis, Nephthys, Meskenet and Hecate, is also described in this extraordinary text, a true story within a story. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened next, as the Westcar papyrus is incomplete and ends just after the description of triplets' birth. We can be certain, however, that the Book of Thoth remained hidden and didn't fall into the wrong hands. These stories are entirely fictional, of course. The king and his successor, Khafre, are historical figures, but the other sons cannot be identified. The first three rulers of the 5th dynasty also couldn't have been born in the early 4th dynasty. This shows how little the authors of these stories knew about their own history. As for the venerable elder deity, nothing in the text indicates that he was a priest. In fact, he didn't have to be one. Generally in pharaonic Egypt, also a sunu, that is a doctor, was considered a magician. Local village healers, called sau, also used magical spells professionally. As we know, there was no medical prescription without magical spells, and diseases were always cast out as demonic entities. Ritual magicians trained in the houses of life were respected members of society, but lay magicians likely aroused fear and dislike, especially in later periods. Roman law prohibited many of their activities, so they practiced unofficially, in a sort of magical underground. Interestingly, we find no mention, either in ancient Egyptian literature or in archaeological finds, of women practicing witchcraft. Literacy, which was much less common among women, may have been one obstacle. Another would have been the requirement of ritual purity. Intercourse with a woman was believed to render a man unfit for temple service, and menstruating women were considered unclean. Although priestesses traditionally served the cult of some of the Egyptian goddesses until late antiquity, it's undeniable that their position steadily declined over time, as did the position of Egyptian women in general. We know that in the earliest times, during the 1st dynasty, royal consorts enjoyed almost equal status to kings. They used Serek, the Horus name, and their tombs were comparable to those of kings. They probably lost this position due to the expansion of the solar cult at the beginning of the Old Kingdom, a cult that significantly strengthened the position of the male ruler. But it must be remembered that regardless of the period, Egyptian women always enjoyed greater rights and freedoms than women in other ancient cultures. The extraordinary events recorded in the Westcar papyrus, such as the resurrection of the dead, the parting of the waters, and the transformation of a wax figure into a crocodile, all somewhat remind us of the miraculous events described in the Bible, which, as we know, also mentions Egyptian magicians. The most famous account of them is found, of course, in Exodus, where we read, "And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, the magicians of Egypt. They also did in like manner with their enchantments. For they cast down, every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods." Interestingly, so-called magic rods seem to have been widely used by the Egyptians, including snake-shaped ones. Lector Priests used a sophisticated type of staff, the best preserved example found in a tomb at Heliopolis from the Middle Kingdom. It's a glazed steatite staff composed of several sections. The sides are decorated with the eyes of Wadjet, baboons, crocodiles and cats. Small figurines of lions, frogs, crocodiles and turtles are attached to the top of the staff with pegs. In later traditions, the magician opponents of Moses are described as the brothers, Janus and Jambres, descended from an ancient priestly lineage. Very early on, they were mentioned in apocryphal texts written from Roman times to the Middle Ages. The apocryphal work known as the Book of Janus and Jambres was written between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, likely in Roman Egypt, and was allegedly written by one of the pharaoh's officials. More recently, in 2024, a nearly complete manuscript of the book in the Ethiopian language was discovered. Until then, only fragments, written among others in Greek and Latin, were known to us. According to the text, after a confrontation with Moses, the magician Janus is stricken with a fatal illness. He may also be punished by the pharaoh, so he entrusts his inheritance and his secret books to his brother and warns him, quote, "And he said to him, Jambres, I hand over to you a document, and keep it in a secret, and take care not to come out on the day on which the king and the chiefs of Egypt come out to pursue the people of the Hebrews, nor to go along with them, but plan to be unwell and save your own soul from death and from the destruction of the Egyptians, which the God of heavens will carry out according to his word on behalf of the children of the Hebrews, whom the Egyptians caused to die in the river." Soon the Egyptian forces pursuing Moses perish in the depths of the Red Sea, and the old priest dies and goes to hell, where he communicates with his brother through magic. According to later traditions, both magicians, seeing Yahweh's power, are said to have converted and left Egypt with the Hebrews. According to some, while crossing the Red Sea, they acquired wings to reach the other side. God then decided to punish them by sending an angel who threw them into the sea. Others believe that the magicians died only during the Hebrews' wanderings in the desert, executed at Moses' command, along with other worshippers of the golden calf. Interestingly, early opponents of Christianity accused Jesus himself of being nothing more than a magician trained in Egypt. Speaking of the Bible, some scholars trace the account of the Queen of Sheba testing Solomon from the first book of Kings in the Old Testament to another Egyptian tale of magicians, the tale of Setna and Sihosira, also known as Setna II, is an Egyptian story preserved on several papyri from the Roman era. However, the story's origins date back to earlier times, to the early late period, that is the 7th century BC. The story lacks any Hellenistic or Roman elements. Its political climate, especially the hostility toward the Nubians, suggests Nubian rule or a time when Egypt was threatened by Nubian invasion, a time when the memory of Ramses the Great was still alive. Setna, a king's son, is loosely based on the historical figure of Prince Kemwaset, son of Ramses the Great and high priest of Memphis, the prince who restored the Memphite necropolises and was a great custodian of Old Kingdom monuments and also a creator of the famous Serapeum at Saqqara, was remembered more as a scholar than a politician. In the first story about Setna, he has an adventure with the magical book of Thoth. In the second story, in Setna II, we meet his extraordinary son, Si-Wusira, meaning son of Osiris, a young man possessing great magical abilities. The text was found on a papyrus scroll belonging to the British Museum. It's written on the back of an official document in Greek dating from the reign of Emperor Claudius. The badly damaged text, put together from numerous fragments, is obviously incomplete, and the initial part of the story has been lost. It is unique, as it concerns not spectacular yet trivial magic tricks, but an epic duel between the magicians of two late Bronze Age powers. At the beginning we learn that Setna and his wife were very worried because they had no son. One night the prince had a dream in which a voice told him, "Menusekha, thy wife, will bring forth a son, and through him many wonders shall be accomplished in the land of Egypt, and the name of thy son shall be Osiris." Finally they had a son, whom Setna loved so much that rarely an hour passed without his seeing him. When Osiris was sent to school, it turned out he knew more than his teachers, poring over magical papyri in the double house of life in the temple of Ptah. Everyone around him was astonished. Soon the pharaoh himself recognized the boy's abilities. His magicians were simply no match for him. One day, the pharaoh was sitting in the audience hall surrounded by princes and generals. One of them said, "Behold, a low-down Ethiopian desires to speak with you, bearing a sealed letter." Pharaoh ordered the man to be brought before him. When he arrived, he bowed down and said, "Here is a sealed letter which I bear, and I would fain know if amongst your wise men there are any who can read its contents without breaking the seals. If, O king, you have not such a one among your scribes and magicians, I shall take back to my country, the land of the blacks, the story of Egypt's failure and inferiority." When writing about Ethiopians, the authors meant Nubians. In fact, the Romans referred to the entire sub-Saharan Africa as Ethiopia. The stranger's words outraged the courtiers, and the pharaoh immediately ordered his son Setna to be brought to him. When he arrived, the pharaoh said, "My son, Setna, have you heard the words of this insolent Ethiopian?" and repeated his provocative challenge. Setna replied, "Great lord, who can read a letter without its being opened and spread before him? But if you will give me 10 days, I will think upon it and do what I can do to avoid the report of Egypt's failure being carried to the blacks, eaters of gum." "Those days are granted, my son," the king replied. Osiris noticed his father's concern and asked what was troubling him. Setna, however, refused to talk, claiming it wasn't a matter for a child. But the boy persisted and eventually learned of the Ethiopian's challenge. Osiris laughed and said, "My father," he answered, "I laugh to see you there, so troubled in heart because of such a small affair. I will read that letter of the Ethiopian, read it all without breaking the seals." "But what proof can you give me of the truth of what you say, my son?" Osiris answered, "My father, go thou to the lower floor of this house and take what books you please from their place. As you do so, I shall read that which you have taken from its place while I stand before you." The boy read every book his father picked up without opening it. Setna immediately informed the pharaoh of the boy's abilities, and the king's heart was so filled with joy that he organized a feast in honor of Setna and his son. Osiris then arrives at the great palace courtyard, where a magical battle is to be fought between two magicians, one Egyptian and one Nubian. it immediately becomes clear that Siwusira not only can read the Nubian's sealed letter, but also exposes him and relays a startling story to the king and courtiers. 1500 years ago, the former king of Nubia, known as the Great Bull, desired to launch a terrible magical attack on Egypt. He gathered his magicians, and from among the proposed actions, two of which resemble the biblical plagues, darkness and pestilence, chose to humiliate the pharaoh by kidnapping him to Nubia and publicly flogging him. Kidnapped magically, beaten 500 times with a stick, and sent back to his palace, the king of Egypt suffers terrible torture and demands from his court magician called Hor, son of Punesh, to free him from Nubian sorcery. Interestingly, a priest named Hor is mentioned in several earlier fragmentary papyri in the Demotic script. This may be the same figure as Hor, son of Punesh. A magician named Hor is also named in the so-called Blackas papyrus from the 5th century BC, discovered at Saqqara. The mysterious text was written in Imperial Aramaic, also referred to as Egyptian Aramaic. The text describes a magician and priest called Bar Punesh, and some see this name as the Egyptian son of Panesha, so our Hor. It's known that Bar Punesh met with the pharaoh and that for his services he was placed over the army of kings and placed among the officials. Perhaps like Ramses II, the priest isn't a fictional character either. But let's get back to the story. Once again, we're dealing with a story within a story. Reading a sealed letter, Siwusira recounts the story of ancient war between two hostile kingdoms that took place 15 centuries earlier. Back then, the ancient ruler of Nubia, humiliated earlier by the Egyptians, took terrible revenge on the pharaoh at the urging of his court magician, Horus, the son of Tnasit. Quote, "By the power of sorcery was Pharaoh taken to the land of the blacks, and there suffered 500 blows of the kurbash. After that, he was carried back to Egypt, as had been said, and waking the next morning in the temple of the god Horus, he lay in great pain, his body sorely bruised. Bewildered, he asked his courtiers how such could have happened in Egypt. They, thinking some madness had fallen upon their king, and yet ashamed of their thoughts, spoke soothingly to him, and said that the great gods would heal his afflictions. But still, they asked him the meaning of his strange words, and suddenly he remembered all that had happened to him and recounted it to his courtiers. When they saw his bruised body, they made a great clamor, and then Pharaoh sent for his chief magician, and he at once cried out that the evil and affliction of the king were due to the sorceries of the Ethiopians. The pharaoh ordered him to hurry so he wouldn't be kidnapped the next night. The chief magician took his secret books and amulets and recited magical words and spells over the king. Then, with many gifts, he boarded a boat and hurried to the temple of Hermopolis. There he prayed to the god Thoth that all evil might be averted from the pharaoh and the land of Egypt. That night he slept in the temple, and in a dream the god Thoth appeared to him and instructed him in divine magic that would protect the king from the wiles of the Nubians. Upon awakening, the magician wrote down a protective spell. The next day, the Nubians tried to repeat their spells, but to no avail. Quote, "Then the magician fashioned a litter and 4 bearers of wax. He put a spell upon them and breathed life into them, bidding them go and bring before Pharaoh the king of the blacks, that he might suffer 500 blows upon his body, and then be carried back to his own land again. And the waxen figures promised to do all as the magician had commanded. And as it happened to Pharaoh, so was the fate of the king of the blacks, who awoke sorely bruised in the morning following. He called loudly for his courtiers, and when they saw the state of their king, they made a great clamor. Again he called and commanded that Horus, the son of Tnasit, be brought before him. When he had come, the king threatened him and commanded him to go to Egypt and there learn how to save him from the sorceries of Pharaoh's chief magician. But no spell devised by the Ethiopian could preserve the king from the magic of the Egyptians, and 3 times was he carried to that country and humiliated, whilst his body was in great pain, so sorely bruised was it. Then he cursed Horus, the son of Tnasit, and threatened him with a slow and dreadful death, unless he could preserve him from Pharaoh's vengeance. Then the Nubian magician Horus, filled with fear and anxiety, went to his mother, the witch Tnasit, who advised him against confronting an enemy he couldn't defeat. Nevertheless, obedient to the king's command, the Nubian set out for Egypt, stood before the pharaoh, and shouted, "Who is it among you who is putting spells upon me?" And Pharaoh's chief magician called out in answer, saying, "Ha, Ethiopian, is it thou who workest evil against Pharaoh?" And Horus, the son of Tnasit, cried out in great anger, and by a spell he caused a great flame to rise from the midst of the hall, at which Pharaoh and the Egyptians cried out to the chief of the magicians to succor them. Then by his power he caused a shower of rain to fall, so that the flame was extinguished. The Nubian then used his magic again, and brought a great darkness upon everyone, so that they couldn't see each other, but this too was dispelled by the Egyptian magician. Then Horus, son of Tnasit, continued his intrigues, but each time he was defeated. Finally he begged for mercy, and swore before the gods that he would never again trouble Egypt or the pharaoh. They gave him a boat and sent him back to his land. This was the story the pharaoh heard from Osiris, who declared that 1500 years had passed and the wicked Nubian sorcerer had returned to once again threaten the land of Egypt and its ruler, hoping that such a perfect magician as Hor, son of Punesh, was no longer in Egypt. After this revelation, the pharaoh sent for the Nubian. When he entered the audience hall, young Osiris took a seat beside him. First the boy cursed the man and his gods if he dared to falsely claim that what he had read wasn't true. Seeing the boy, the Nubian fell prostrate before him in fear. Osiris said to him, "The curse of Amun falls upon thee. These words that I have said, are they not written in the letter thou holdest in thine hand?" And the rascally Ethiopian bowed low before him, saying, "They are written there, my lord." So he revealed to all present, the pharaoh, the princes and the generals, that the Nubian standing before them was none other than Horus, son of Tnasit, who had returned after centuries to once again trouble Egypt and its king, and that he himself, Osiris, son of Setna, was born for this special day again, because he was the reincarnation of the former great magician in the service of the ancient pharaoh, the magician who had returned to save Egypt and its king once more. Quote, "And with these words he caused a great flame to consume the Ethiopian, there in the midst of the hall of audience, so that not a vestige of the creature remained. But afterward, When they looked for Osiris, he had disappeared as a shadow from before Pharaoh and his father Setna, and never again was he seen of them. At these events, everyone was astonished, and the pharaoh declared that Osiris was the wisest and most brilliant of all magicians, and that the world would never see his like again. But Setna and his wife were heartbroken, and they mourned their son greatly. Then consolation came to them. Setna's wife gave birth to another son, whom they named Usimantor. It seems that the Egyptians didn't underestimate magical threats to the state and the person of the pharaoh. The so-called rolling papyrus and the Lee papyrus from the 12th century BC, from the times of Ramses IV, describe a plot by courtiers who sought to get rid of his father Ramses III through acts of sorcery, and among the evidence of the crime were magical wax figurines mentioned in this court transcript, as if in much later medieval witch trials. Ramses III was annihilated by his own courtiers, but both magical and literary texts often portray hostile ritualists as foreigners, primarily from Nubia, but also from Libya and Syria. Perhaps it was the strange and unknown customs of the numerous foreigners arriving in Egypt that worried the authors. God left humans Heka, the magic, to defend themselves against evil and the blows of fate, and they used it to the best of their ability, both in this life and in the next. In ancient Egyptian beliefs, this magic consisted of knowledge of the words of power that in a previous era had shaped the world and brought new beings to life. The tongue of the great god who spoke these words was the wise Thoth. He invented writing and used it to record spells in a wondrous book, which was carefully hidden from profane eyes. The most famous seeker of the lost book was already known to us Setna. The story of its discovery is contained in the text called Setna I. I discussed it in one of my earlier podcasts. The book was enclosed in a golden box, which was then placed inside a silver box, which was then carefully hidden in an ivory and ebony box. This was placed in a cinnamon wood box and then inside a copper and later an iron box. Finally, on Thoth's orders, it was sunk in the Nile near the city of Coptos. Poisonous reptiles and scorpions took over its protection, and an eternal serpent dwelt on its lid, effectively deterred all intruders. Despite these safeguards, the memory of the Book of Thoth didn't perish, as the gods mercifully shared some fragments to protect the virtuous dead from demonic attacks. These spells, which the Egyptians believed were discovered by the first dynasty king Den, were later copied and incorporated into the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and finally into the Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom. Indeed, judging by amulets found in tombs dating back to the 4th millennium BC, magic was a part of Egyptian culture from the very beginning. In Roman times, private ritual magic likely began to be widely used for profit, succumbed to foreign influences, and increasingly became characterized by sacrilege and malediction. In one of the religious philosophical texts known as the Hermetica, Thoth recommends that his words be written down but made available only to initiates, morally and intellectually worthy of his secret knowledge. This special secrecy is explained by fear of persecution. Already the first Roman emperor and conqueror of Egypt, Augustus, ordered the destruction of thousands of magical books. In Roman times, we observed the emergence and development of numerous religious philosophical concepts, giving rise to the esoteric movement. Elements of ancient Egyptian spirituality can be found in Hermeticism, the concept of the Logos, Gnostic emanations, and the belief in the magical properties of Egyptian hieroglyphs. The 16th century Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno developed the theory that the magic of ancient Egypt was not just the oldest, but the only true religion of mankind. He was burned at the stake for heresy, of course. In fact, until the 19th century, so until the birth and development of Egyptology, the magicians, their secret knowledge, and legendary achievements were the true symbol of ancient Egypt, a symbol somewhat forgotten today. Well, I hope you learned something new about the beliefs of ancient Egyptians. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next time. I'd also like to thank all my patrons. I truly appreciate your contribution. Thank you. If you don't support me yet, but would like to, I placed my Patreon link below in the description. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye, and see you on the next one.